The Stowaway of the Atlantic Queen, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The Lady Who Dined Alone. The Atlantic Queen was, by any reasonable measure, the most distinguished vessel to have crossed the North Atlantic in the autumn of 1934. She was not the largest. The great liners of the Cunard White Star Line still commanded that distinction, but she possessed something that mere tonnage could never purchase. An atmosphere of refined exclusivity that her owners, the Meridian Steamship Company, cultivated with the same deliberate care one might apply to the aging of a fine Bordeaux. Her passenger manifest for the crossing from Southampton to New York numbered precisely 112 souls in first class, 47 in second, and a great many more in third, whose names did not appear in the leather-bound social register kept by the chief purser, Mr. Oswald Fenwick, a dapper little man whose principal qualification for the post appeared to be an encyclopedic knowledge of European aristocracy and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. It was the third evening of the crossing, and the first-class dining saloon hummed with the particular contentment that follows a smooth sea and an excellent consommé. The room was panelled in pale ash wood with inlaid medallions of lapis lazuli, and the lighting, softened through amber shades, lent every diner a flattering, almost theatrical glow. The orchestra, tucked discreetly behind a screen of potted palms, played Strauss waltzes with professional precision and no particular feeling. Captain Archibald Morrow, a broad-shouldered man of 60, with a white beard trimmed to naval exactitude, presided at the captain's table with the practiced ease of a man who had made 47 Atlantic crossings and found them, on balance, rather predictable. To his left sat Sir Edmund Hartwell, a recently retired judge of considerable reputation, whose face retained the permanently sceptical expression that decades on the bench had made permanent. To his right sat Lady Dorothea Fanshawe, a widow of 62, whose diamonds were, by general consensus, both real and excessive. At a smaller table near the starboard windows, somewhat apart from the main social current, sat a young woman dining alone. She was perhaps 28, with the sort of dark auburn hair that photographs invariably failed to capture correctly, and pale grey eyes that moved constantly about the room, with an alertness that seemed at odds with her otherwise composed demeanour. She had given her name to the purser as Miss Cecily Marsh, travelling from London, occupation unspecified. She had taken her meals alone each evening, declined all invitations to join the card parties that formed nightly in the smoking room, and had been observed by the steward, Morrison, standing at the stern rail for long periods at dusk, watching England's absence with considerable intensity. She ordered the duck, ate perhaps half of it, drank one glass of Burgundy, and departed before the dessert trolley completed its first circuit. The person who noticed her departure most acutely was not the attentive Morrison, nor the socially observant Lady Fanshawe, but a small, precisely dressed Belgian gentleman at the adjacent table, whose magnificently waxed moustaches twitched with the faintest suggestion of professional interest. Hercule Poirot had not planned to cross the Atlantic in October. He had in fact planned a recuperative fortnight in the south of France, following a particularly taxing business in the matter of a forged will in Gloucestershire. But his friend, Dr. Shepperton of Harley Street, had recommended the sea air with such medical authority that Poirot had found himself, somewhat against his better instincts, aboard the Atlantic Queen, with 2 trunks, 7 waistcoats, and a profound distrust of the ocean in general. He watched the empty chair where Miss Cecily Marsh had sat. He noted the wine-glass, barely touched. He noted the way she had folded her table napkin, not casually, but with a particular precision, squared at the edges, placed just so. He noted the small leather-bound notebook she had drawn from her evening bag twice during the meal, written in quickly, then snapped shut. Most singular, Poirot murmured to himself, applying himself to his own excellent soul. Across the saloon, Sir Edmund Hartwell was holding forth on the subject of criminal sentencing, a topic that Lady Fanshawe found deeply fascinating in the way that people of a certain social position find all evidence of the world's disorder simultaneously shocking and entertaining. Seated at the captain's table but contributing very little to this or any other conversation was a man who had been introduced as Mr. Gerald Forsyth, an English businessman of apparently considerable prosperity, travelling on what he described as a commercial matter of some delicacy. He was perhaps 50, with a square jaw, iron-grey hair, brushed back severely from a high forehead, and eyes of a peculiar flat blue that reminded Poirot, somewhat unsettlingly, of the eyes one encountered in certain portraits of historical figures, authoritative, contained, and fundamentally unrevealing. Mr. Forsyth ate methodically and said little, but Poirot observed that his gaze returned, at intervals of approximately 3 to 4 minutes, to the table near the starboard windows. Even after Miss Marsh had departed, his attention remained fixed on that location, with the blind persistence of a compass needle that has not yet received the correction it requires. The evening concluded without incident. The orchestra finished with a Viennese medley. The stewards cleared the tables with silent efficiency. Captain Morrow retired to his bridge with the satisfied expression of a man who commanded a well-ordered world. At 11:30, Poirot took a brief constitutional along the promenade deck, pausing to admire the extraordinary architecture of the night sky over the open Atlantic, a sky so thick with stars that it produced in him, despite himself, a sensation he could only identify as humility. He was about to descend to his stateroom when a sound reached him, a voice, low and urgent, coming from somewhere below the promenade rail, perhaps from the boat deck. 2 voices, in fact, a man's and a woman's. The words were indistinct, swallowed by the wash of the sea and the constant low vibration of the ship's engines, but the emotional register was entirely legible. Fear, unmistakably. Fear, and something that sounded very much like a threat. Poirot stood quite still for a moment, his head tilted at that particular angle which his friends, had any of them been present, would have recognized as a sign of maximum attention. Then the voices ceased. He heard footsteps receding in opposite directions, then only the sea. He descended to his stateroom, sat before his dressing-table mirror for some time in thoughtful silence, and then retired, leaving word with his steward that he should not be disturbed before 8 o'clock. At 20 minutes past 6 the following morning, the ship's alarm was sounded. A body had been found. Chapter 2. The Man Without a Cabin. The body was discovered by Morrison, the first-class steward, at 18 minutes past 6 on the morning of October the 9th. He had been making his customary early circuit of the first-class deck, straightening the cushions on the deck chairs, collecting the few glasses left by late-evening strollers, when he had found the man lying at the base of the companionway that connected the promenade deck to the boat deck below. The man was on his back, arms slightly outstretched, in the particular attitude of someone who had ceased to make decisions about his own position. He was dressed in dark trousers, a collarless shirt, and a heavy jacket of the sort favoured by working men, wholly inconsistent with the first-class surroundings in which he lay. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, weathered face and large, calloused hands. He had not shaved recently. He had not, by any visible evidence, been travelling as a passenger of the Atlantic Queen at all. Morrison, to his credit, did not touch anything. He located the duty officer, Lieutenant Pemberton, within 4 minutes. Pemberton, equally sensibly, closed off the immediate area, summoned the ship's doctor, and then, in an act of institutional prudence that Poirot would later commend, went directly to the captain's cabin. By 8 o'clock, when Poirot's steward arrived with his morning chocolate, the news had already percolated through the first-class corridor with the efficiency that gossip always achieves aboard ships, where there is nowhere to go and very little else to discuss. "A man found dead, sir," the steward reported, with the particular combination of gravity and suppressed excitement that such news naturally produces. On the promenade deck, Not one of our passengers, they're saying. Poirot received this intelligence with a stillness that the steward found slightly unnerving. He set down his chocolate cup. He looked for a moment at the porthole, where the Atlantic moved past in grey, indifferent swells. "So," said Poirot very quietly, "it begins." He dressed with customary care. The dark suit, the perfectly knotted tie, the moustaches attended to with the small ivory-handled brushes he travelled with, as a matter of professional necessity, and presented himself at the captain's day cabin at 8:30, having first established, through the intelligence network of sympathetic stewards that he had cultivated over 2 days of generous tipping, precisely where the official investigation was being conducted. Captain Moreau received him with the wariness of a man who has been informed that a famous detective is aboard and cannot decide whether this is fortunate or inconvenient. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk, "I had intended to call upon you this morning, and I have saved you the trouble, mon capitaine," Poirot replied pleasantly. He accepted the indicated chair and folded his hands upon his knee. "This dead man, tell me everything, if you please." The doctor, a capable Scotsman named Dr. Angus Finlay, had established that death had occurred between midnight and 3 in the morning, the narrower precision that the cooling of the body in the sea air made difficult. The cause of death was a single blow to the base of the skull, not from the fall itself, but administered beforehand, with an object of moderate weight and smooth surface. The fall down the companionway steps had occurred after death, or at the very moment of it. The location of the body suggested it had been arranged, or at minimum that whoever had been with the man at the moment of his death had not immediately raised the alarm. The critical mystery, however, was simpler and more fundamental than the question of method. "The man is not on our passenger manifest," Captain Moreau said. "He is not listed among the crew. I have had every name checked against the roster. He has no luggage. He has no cabin. He has no ticket. He has no papers of any kind on his person." He paused. "Mr. Fenwick, my purser, suggests, well, he suggests the word that I find it difficult to associate with a vessel of this class." "A stowaway," Poirot said. "A stowaway." The captain repeated it with the distaste of a man pronouncing a diagnosis he had hoped to avoid. "On the Atlantic Queen." Poirot was quiet for a moment. "And yet someone knew he was aboard," he said presently. "Someone knew well enough to kill him. That is rather my concern, yes. You have questioned the crew regarding how such a person might have boarded without detection. My first officer is conducting that inquiry now. The most probable explanation is that he came aboard at Southampton concealed among the cargo or the supplies. There are always gaps in the loading procedure, despite our precautions." The captain's tone made clear this was a matter of considerable institutional embarrassment. "And the passengers? Is it possible any of the passengers are acquainted with this man?" Captain Moreau hesitated in a way that Poirot found distinctly informative. "I had Morrison show his face, that is, describe him, to the stewards. There is one report. It may be nothing." "In a murder investigation," Poirot said gently, "nothing is nothing." The captain opened a drawer and produced a single sheet of paper bearing a brief written statement. The night steward on the first-class corridor, a man named Hobbs, states that at approximately 11:40 last night, he observed a passenger from this corridor, he is not certain which, descending the internal stairway that leads to the cargo access passages. The passenger was moving quickly and appeared to be, his word, agitated. Poirot received this information with great composure. "And the first-class corridor serves how many passengers?" 14 staterooms, 22 passengers in all." 22, Poirot said. He rose, smoothed his lapels, and directed his most benign smile at the captain. "I wonder, mon capitaine, if you might introduce me, at the appropriate moment, as someone travelling in a purely private capacity, who happens to have been retained, shall we say, as a consultant in matters of a sensitive nature. I find that people speak more freely when they do not feel they are under official examination." You want me to conceal that you're investigating. I want you to allow people the comfortable illusion that they are not suspects, Poirot corrected pleasantly. They almost always are, of course, but the illusion encourages candor. He paused at the door. One more thing, mon capitaine. The woman who dines alone. Miss Cecily Marsh. What do you know of her? The captain's expression underwent a subtle but perceptible change. Very little, he said. Her booking was made through a London agency, paid in cash. Her references, which we required for the first-class manifest, are, my purser has since noted, not entirely verifiable. Ah, said Poirot, très intéressant. He departed with the particular measured tread of a man who has received, in the space of 30 minutes, 3 times more information than he appeared to have asked for. Chapter 3. 22 Ways to Lie. Poirot spent the morning in unhurried observation. This was, he had long maintained, the most productive phase of any investigation, the period before people knew with certainty that they were being watched, and therefore before they had fully committed to the particular version of themselves they intended to present. By 10 o'clock, the news of the dead man had reached every passenger in first class, and the social atmosphere had undergone the transformation that violent death always produced in confined communities. People gathered in small groups with the instinctive herding behavior of animals that have detected a predator. Voices were lower. Laughter, when it occurred, carried the slightly artificial quality of laughter deployed against anxiety. Poirot installed himself in the first-class lounge with a cup of his preferred tisane and a posture of complete relaxation, and proceeded to conduct a masterclass in appearing to notice nothing while noticing everything. Gerald Forsyth was present, seated in a leather armchair near the window, reading a newspaper with rather too much concentration for a man whose reading glasses he had not put on. He had arrived in the lounge at 9:55, glanced once at the door, and then not again, the deliberate non-glancing of someone who was very much hoping a particular person would arrive, and did not wish to appear to be waiting for them. Lady Fanshawe was there, enormously present in a morning gown of yellow silk, holding court with 3 other ladies over coffee and biscuits. She had already, Poirot gathered from fragments carried across the room, elevated the discovery of the stowaway's body to the status of a personal anecdote. I said to my maid Higgins, I said, one always feels these crossings have a certain risk. Sir Edmund Hartwell sat alone, as the judge's habit of solitary contemplation apparently extended to leisure as well. He held a small leather volume that appeared to be a collection of legal essays, but his eyes, Poirot noticed, had not moved down the page in some time. At 11, Miss Cecily Marsh entered the lounge. The response was interesting. Forsyth's newspaper remained absolutely still. Sir Edmund's eyes lifted from his unread page and settled on Miss Marsh with an attention that he made no attempt to conceal. Lady Fanshawe's monologue continued without interruption, but the slight stiffening of her companion, Mrs. Agatha Rowe, a thin, birch-pale woman who appeared to travel as Lady Fanshawe's social secretary, suggested that Mrs. Rowe, at least, had noted the arrival. Miss Marsh crossed the room, selected a chair at some distance from all other occupied furniture, and opened a novel. She read it, as far as Poirot could determine, with genuine absorption. After an interval of approximately 20 minutes, Poirot rose, replaced his tisane cup with the care of a man performing a ritual, and contrived, by the most natural-seeming series of movements, to settle himself in a chair that happened to be proximate to Miss Marsh's. "The sea is calmer today," he observed pleasantly, to no one in particular. "Yes," said Miss Marsh without looking up. "I find on these crossings that a calm sea is both a blessing and, how shall I say, a slight diminishment. The drama of a rough sea has its own interest." She looked up then. Her grey eyes assessed him with the rapid competence of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about strangers. "You are Hercule Poirot," she said. It was not a question. "I am, mademoiselle." "And you are Miss Cecily Marsh. You've been speaking with the captain." "I have been speaking with many people," Poirot said pleasantly. "It is my unfortunate habit. But I wonder if I might ask you a small question, purely from curiosity, you understand." "I understand nothing of the sort," she said, but she did not return to her book. "What do you want to know?" "Last night, on the promenade deck, at approximately 11:30, I heard voices, a conversation of some urgency. I am curious whether you might have heard something similar." The change in her expression was brief, a tightening, a decision being made, and then it was gone, replaced by something carefully neutral. "I went to bed early last night. I'm afraid I can't help you." She returned to her novel with finality. Poirot rose, bowed with small formal correctness, and moved away. He had obtained rather more than he had asked for, because what Miss Cecily Marsh had done, so smoothly, so quickly, was lie. He was certain of it, and the certainty was interesting not merely because she had lied, but because she had lied so competently. This was not the improvised deception of a guilty conscience caught unprepared. This was practiced. This was professional. He interviewed 6 other first-class passengers before luncheon, always by apparent accident, always with the manner of a charming and somewhat idle Belgian gentleman with a fondness for conversation. He gathered the following. Mr. Gerald Forsyth had been, according to his own account, in his stateroom by 10 o'clock and asleep by 10:30. He offered this information without being asked for it, which Poirot noted as precisely the sort of preemptive alibi construction that experienced investigators were supposed to find reassuring, and that Poirot found entirely the opposite. Sir Edmund Hartwell had taken a walk on the promenade deck at around 11, which he mentioned in passing while discussing the deteriorating standards of Atlantic crossings. He had seen no one, heard nothing unusual, and retired at 11:15. Mrs. Agatha Rowe, consulted while apparently admiring the view from the observation lounge, had been with Lady Fanshawe until 10, then retired. She was nervous in a way that could be attributed to the general anxiety of the situation, but that Poirot thought might have additional causes. 3 other passengers offered accounts of various convincing tedium. None, in Poirot's estimation, were telling him the complete truth, but that was not extraordinary. People almost never told the complete truth. The question was always which of the lies mattered. At luncheon, Poirot was seated, by the purser's discreet arrangement, adjacent to Sir Edmund Hartwell. The judge ate his roast beef with the deliberate thoroughness that characterises men who take even their pleasures seriously. "You were a judge of the King's Bench, I believe," Poirot said conversationally. "King's Bench Division, yes. 31 years. A long acquaintance with human dishonesty." Sir Edmund looked at him sharply. "One might put it that way, though I always preferred to think of it as an acquaintance with the full range of human motivation." "A more generous formulation," Poirot agreed. "Tell me, Sir Edmund, in your experience, when a person is genuinely innocent of wrongdoing, how do they typically behave when accused, or merely suspected?" The judge considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "The innocent person," he said slowly, "is almost always more frightened than the guilty one, because the innocent person understands that innocence, by itself, is no guarantee of anything. And the guilty person? The guilty person," said Sir Edmund, "knows exactly what they did, and therefore knows exactly what needs concealing. It gives them a certain focus." He returned to his roast beef. Poirot looked at his own plate thoughtfully. "That is," he said, "most illuminating." Chapter 4. The ship's surgeon speaks plainly. Dr. Angus Finlay had the manner of a man who had spent enough years at sea to have concluded that most of the world's complications were, at root, unnecessary. He was 60, lean, with a grey-streaked beard and the kind of eyes that had looked at a great many difficult things, and continued, despite this, to look directly. He received Poirot in his surgery at 3 in the afternoon, offered him a chair. There was only one, which suggested Dr. Finlay was not in the habit of lengthy consultations, and spoke without preamble. "You want to know about the dead man, beyond what I've told the captain, if you please. His hands." Dr. Finlay placed his own hands flat on the desk between them, as though demonstrating, "The calluses are consistent with cargo handling. Specifically, the particular pattern I've seen in men who work with ropes and winches over many years. Dock work, most likely, or ship's crew, but not our crew. Our crew have callus patterns I know well. This man's hands are somewhat different." "Different how?" "Older work. Heavier. The kind of labour you find in the merchant marine, or in smaller vessels, fishing boats, coastal freighters. Not a man accustomed to passenger liners. Could he have been a professional stowaway, someone experienced at boarding vessels undetected?" Finlay shook his head. "His clothing is wrong for that. A professional stowaway dresses to blend, to disappear. This man wore working clothes without any attempt at concealment. Either he came aboard quickly, without preparation, or he didn't particularly care about being found. Which of those do you favour?" The doctor paused. "Neither, actually. I think he expected to have protection. Someone aboard was expecting him. Someone was meant to ensure he was kept hidden and fed until he could be quietly put ashore in New York, and something went wrong with that arrangement." He paused. "That's speculation, of course. You're the detective." "Speculation built on observation," Poirot said. "In my experience, that is precisely what good detection looks like." Dr. Finlay opened a desk drawer and produced a small envelope. "There is one more thing, found in the lining of his jacket. The outer lining had been partially stitched shut, a hidden pocket of sorts." He handed the envelope across. "We did not mention this to the captain yet. I wanted your view of it first." Inside the envelope was a small piece of paper folded twice. On it, written in pencil in a cramped hand, was a single line. "R. Stateroom 14. Has what you seek. Be certain." Poirot read it twice, then folded it along its original creases and held it at the edges with 2 fingers. "The stateroom number's in first class," he said. "14 is assigned to Mr. Gerald Forsyth," said Dr. Finlay. "Yes, I checked." A silence settled between the 2 men that was, in its way, a great deal more eloquent than conversation. "This note," Poirot said presently. "The paper, the pencil. They are English, I think. The handwriting, educated. Someone accustomed to writing who chose, for reasons of caution, to use a simple pencil on plain paper. Not an educated man's casual note. A deliberate choice. I noticed the same. The R, is it a name, an abbreviation? Almost certainly a name. Or the initial of a name. The dead man's name, perhaps. We do not know it yet. Or the name of someone he worked for." Poirot replaced the paper in the envelope and handed it back. "I must ask that you present this to the captain, Dr. Finlay. But not immediately. Give me, shall we say, 6 hours." The doctor looked at him steadily. "You're asking me to withhold evidence from the ship's commander. I am asking you to allow me the time to have a conversation that this note makes necessary, before the note becomes official and its subject begins to prepare his position." Poirot held his gaze. "A man is dead, Doctor. There are things about the manner of his death and about certain events on this ship that suggest the danger has not necessarily concluded. I would prefer to prevent a second death, if that remains possible." Finlay was quiet for a long moment. 4 hours, he said finally, not 6. 4 hours is perfectly adequate, Poirot said, and he meant it. He was on his feet and at the surgery door before the doctor could add any qualifications. "One final question. The blow that killed him, the instrument. You said smooth surface, moderate weight. Consistent with a glass bottle, a full one, or nearly full, or a weighted cosh of smooth leather, or a smooth-faced piece of metal. Nothing with edges. Nothing that would have required significant physical strength. A firm blow, well aimed, not a powerful one, A person of ordinary build could have managed it, if they struck from behind and knew what they were doing. If they knew what they were doing, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that is the phrase that interests me most. He thanked the doctor and walked the long corridor back to the first-class section with a deliberately unhurried tread, thinking about the difference between a person who strikes in passion and a person who knows what they are doing. The difference, in his experience, was not merely one of degree, it was one of character. Passion was ordinary, competence was specific, and competence of this particular kind, the competence to kill quickly, cleanly, and without leaving obvious evidence, suggested a person who had, at minimum, considered the possibility beforehand. Not a spontaneous act, a prepared one. Someone on this ship had been prepared, perhaps for some time, for the necessity of killing the man called R. Chapter 5. The Portrait in Stateroom 9. He went first, deliberately, not to Stateroom 14. Poirot had learned over many years that the most productive path to understanding a man was rarely through the man himself. People who know they are suspected become performances. People in their vicinity, however, people who observe them, who react to them, who have their own investments in particular narratives, those people were frequently far more revealing. Stateroom 9 was occupied by Mrs. Agatha Rowe, who served as Lady Fanshaw's companion and social secretary, and who had, in Poirot's assessment, more anxiety in her thin frame than the general alarm of the situation fully explained. She answered his knock with an expression that confirmed his instinct. She had been expecting someone, and he was not the right someone, and for a fraction of a second, before the expected mask descended, he could see the relief and the disappointment competing. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I'm afraid Lady Fanshawe is resting." "It is not Lady Fanshawe I wish to speak with," Poirot said pleasantly. "It is you, Mrs. Rowe. Might I come in? It is rather a sensitive matter." She stepped back and admitted him with the mechanical courtesy of someone who has practiced deference so long that it operates independently of their actual wishes. The stateroom was small and crowded with Lady Fanshaw's overflow luggage, 5 large trunks and an assortment of hat boxes that had clearly migrated from the adjacent suite to Mrs. Rowe's accommodation as though by natural expansion. Mrs. Rowe sat on the edge of the single chair and folded her hands in her lap with the precision of someone who has discovered that keeping the hands still prevents them from revealing information. "You have been with Lady Fanshawe for several years," Poirot began. 7 years. A slight relaxation. This was safe ground. "And before that, I had various positions. Private secretary, primarily. I was with a firm of solicitors in Bristol for 4 years before Lady Fanshawe engaged me." "A solicitor's firm." Poirot examined this information. "Then you have some familiarity with legal documents, contracts, that sort of arrangement." "Elementary familiarity, yes." "And Mr. Gerald Forsyth, you know him?" The hands tightened. "He is a fellow passenger. I know him as such." "Mrs. Rowe." Poirot leaned forward very slightly, just enough to alter the register of the conversation. "I am not the police. What you tell me I will use with discretion, in the service of discovering who killed a man whose death this ship cannot afford to explain inadequately. If there is something you know, something that connects you, or Lady Fanshawe, or indeed anyone on this vessel to that dead man in the corridor, I promise you that my interest is in the truth, nothing more and nothing less." She was silent for so long that the ship's vibrations seemed to become audible in the silence. A low, constant hum, the sound of the Atlantic Queen's great engines turning against the resisting sea. "I worked for a firm of solicitors in Bristol," she said at last, in a voice stripped of its social register and reduced to something plainer. 4 years. And in the last 6 months of those 4 years, the firm handled a substantial conveyancing matter for a client who was transferring a considerable property from one name to another. The property was a warehouse complex in Bristol Docks. And the client? The name on the original documentation was one thing, but I typed the secondary filing, the registration in the new name, and the beneficial ownership documentation, and the name on those documents was not the same as the client who came to the office. The beneficial owner was concealed. Yes, and I shouldn't have noticed, and I did notice, because I have a good memory for names, and 6 months before that transaction, I had typed a different document for a different file, and the name on the beneficial ownership document was the same as a name that appeared, in a very different context, in that earlier file. A criminal matter that the firm was defending, a fraud. She stopped. Poirot waited. The man who truly owned those docs, she said quietly, through 3 layers of companies and a solicitor, I now believe was fully party to the arrangement. His name was listed in the fraud file as a co-defendant, though the charges against him were eventually dropped. His name was Gerald Forsyth. Poirot sat very still for a moment. And the dead man, he said. She shook her head. I don't know who the dead man is. I truly don't. But Gerald Forsyth has been watching me since we boarded this ship. Every meal, every time I appear in a public room. He watches me, Monsieur Poirot, in the way that people watch someone who knows something they shouldn't know. You believe he recognized you. I believe he is terrified of me, she said, which, in the circumstances, terrifies me considerably in return. Poirot thanked her and departed. He stood for a moment in the corridor, the ship moving steadily beneath him, and thought about Gerald Forsyth, who was afraid of a thin woman in a borrowed stateroom, and about a dead man with a note sewn into his jacket lining, and about a woman with grey eyes and a carefully folded napkin. The little grey cells were very busy indeed. Chapter 6. What the telescope showed. He found Forsyth on the boat deck, standing at the rail, with his hands behind his back, and his gaze directed at the horizon, with the unseeing intensity of a man conducting an internal argument. Mr. Forsyth, Poirot said, you will forgive the intrusion. Forsyth turned. If he was surprised, he contained it well. His flat blue eyes moved over Poirot with a rapid assessment that confirmed, in Poirot's estimation, that this was a man accustomed to quickly establishing the threat level of any new element in his environment. Monsieur Poirot, he said. The detective. Retired, Poirot said pleasantly. I travel only for my health, the sea air. He joined Forsyth at the rail, looking out at the indifferent ocean. You have been aboard this ship before, I think. A fractional pause. No, my first crossing on the Atlantic Queen. But you know the ship's layout well. I have observed you moving through the corridors with the ease of familiarity. I've crossed on similar vessels. The design is standard. Yes, Poirot said agreeably. The design is standard, and yet the arrangement of the cargo holds varies, I believe, from ship to ship. The access points particularly. Forsyth was very still. The wind moved his iron-grey hair. I don't see what the cargo holds have to do with anything. A man was found dead near an access point to the cargo section, Poirot said, in precisely the same pleasant conversational tone. A man who had boarded this ship without a ticket, without a cabin, and apparently without the knowledge of anyone official, which means he had the knowledge of someone unofficial. He paused. You are a businessman, I understand. Commercial interests in Bristol, among other places. Among many other places, the Bristol docks specifically. For the first time something moved behind the flat blue eyes. Not fear exactly, something more calculated than fear. A reassessment. What is it you want, Monsieur Poirot? I want only what I always want. The truth. The truth, Forsyth said, is a very expensive commodity in commercial life. In my experience, Poirot replied, lies are more expensive. They compound. They require maintenance. And eventually they demand a price that no sensible businessman would have chosen to pay at the outset. He turned from the rail. I wonder, Mr. Forsyth, the dead man. You do not know him. You will tell me. I've never seen him. You have not yet been shown his description. Another pause. more infinitesimal than the first, but present. I heard the description circulating this morning. Ah, yes. The circular of information aboard a ship. Very efficient. Poirot began to move away, then paused as if struck by an afterthought, an effect he had perfected over decades. One small question. There was a letter found in the dead man's effects. The initial R appears. Does that initial suggest to you any person of your acquaintance? R is a very common initial. It is, Poirot agreed. And yet some letters are more common in some contexts than others. R for Robert, for Roger, for Richard, perhaps. He watched Forsyth's face. Nothing moved. Or R for Renard, perhaps, the French word for fox. He smiled. You have, I hope, a pleasant afternoon, Monsieur Forsyth. He descended to the promenade deck, his mind arranging and rearranging its pieces with the particular pleasure he took in a problem that was genuinely difficult. The note had addressed its message to R, which meant the dead man had carried a message for someone aboard this ship, not from someone aboard, to someone. The dead man had not come to threaten. He had come to deliver information. Has what you seek. Be certain. The dead man had been a courier, and a courier who had been killed before the delivery was complete, which meant either the intended recipient had killed him to prevent that delivery, or a third party had killed him to prevent the recipient from receiving it. Two entirely different crimes with entirely different implications. He needed, urgently, to know the dead man's name. He needed to know what Gerald Forsyth sought. And he needed, above all, to understand what Cecily Marsh, with her professional lies and her watchful eyes, was actually doing on this ship. He found the answer to one of those questions unexpectedly while passing the library. Through the half-open door, he saw Sir Edmund Hartwell, standing before the small notice board on which various ship announcements were pinned. The judge was not reading the announcements. He was holding a small photograph, the kind kept in a breast pocket, pressed close to the body, and looking at it with an expression that Poirot had rarely seen on a man of Sir Edmund's controlled temperament. Grief, raw and total and carefully kept, until this unguarded moment, completely private. Poirot did not enter the library. He passed the doorway quietly and continued to his own stateroom, where he sat for a long time with his hands together and his eyes closed, thinking about a judge who grieved in private and kept a photograph in his breast pocket on a sea voyage to New York. Chapter 7. The Name Below the Waterline. The dead man's name was established at 4 o'clock that afternoon, when the first officer, pursuing his inquiry into how the Stowaway had boarded, located a cargo handler at Southampton named Birch, who, upon being contacted by wireless, provided a description that matched and a name. Thomas Renner. Poirot received this information from Captain Morrow with the attention it deserved. Thomas Renner. The R of the note resolved, at least in one direction. Not the recipient, but the sender, perhaps, or a name associated with the message. Thomas Renner, who had calloused hands and a message sewn into his jacket. Do you know the name? The captain asked. Not as such, but I know what it implies. Poirot looked at the name written in the captain's logbook. Thomas Renner was a man of the docks, a cargo handler, a porter, a man who moves things between one location and another, not only physical things, information, objects, perhaps documents. He paused. I believe, mon capitaine, that Thomas Renner was bringing a document, or evidence of some kind, to a passenger on this ship. The note confirms a delivery was intended. He was killed before he could complete it. By the intended recipient? Forsyth? That is one possibility. Poirot was careful here. There is another. Someone else on this ship knew that Thomas Renner was coming, knew what he carried, and killed him to prevent the delivery from taking place. Not because they didn't want the information received, but because they wanted to possess the information themselves. The captain absorbed this. That would mean 2 people on this ship are connected to the dead man. At minimum, Poirot paused. "I should like to speak with your night steward, Hobbs," the man who observed someone on the internal stairway. Hobbs was a thin young man from Liverpool whose natural expression of anxiety had, in the past 24 hours, intensified to something approaching genuine distress. He confirmed his earlier account with only minor elaborations. The passenger had been moving quickly, carrying nothing visible, wearing dark clothing. He had not seen the face clearly. The corridor lighting at that hour was reduced. But he had formed a general impression. A woman or a slight man, Hobbs said. The build was not large. The movement was quick but light. You know, light-footed like. The clothing, dark. What kind of dark? A coat? A dressing gown? Hobbs thought. A coat, I'd say, full length, like an evening coat, or a long motor coat. Dark navy or black, moved quickly. Poirot thanked him and released him. He stood in the corridor for some time afterward. A slight build, light-footed, a long dark coat, moving quickly toward the cargo access passage at 11:40 at night. He thought of Miss Cecily Marsh with her quick, light movements and her professional lies. He thought of Mrs. Agatha Rowe, thin as birch, terrified in her stateroom full of hat boxes. He thought of the fact that both women were connected, in different ways, to Gerald Forsyth, and the shadow of fraud that Forsyth carried like a second, darker suit. He went to stateroom 14 at 5:15. Forsyth answered his own door, which suggested he had dismissed his steward, unusual for a man of his apparent social standing. The stateroom was neat, almost ostentatiously so, luggage in perfect order, nothing on surfaces that should not be on surfaces. The neatness, Poirot observed, of a man who had recently searched through his own belongings to determine what, if anything, had been disturbed. "Monsieur Poirot, again. A brief visit only," Poirot assured him. "I wished only to tell you something, for your own peace of mind." The dead man's name was Thomas Renner, a dock worker from Southampton. The name produced nothing on Forsyth's face, which was itself a kind of information. The controlled non-reaction of someone who had prepared for this moment. "I'm sorry to hear a man has died," Forsyth said. "I still don't know him." "Of course." Poirot paused. "There is a document. I believe you know what I mean by that. I believe you know what Thomas Renner was bringing to you, and why you needed it, and why your possession of it would constitute a considerable advantage in some, let us say, commercial arrangement." He held Forsyth's flat blue gaze. "The document was not on Thomas Renner's body. Whoever killed him did not know, I think, precisely where it was concealed, or if they searched him, they searched inexpertly." Something shifted in Forsyth's eyes then, not fear, but a different calculation. He was wondering what Poirot knew, and what Poirot was offering. "If such a document existed," Forsyth said carefully, "and if it pertained to business arrangements of a sensitive kind, who else on this ship might be aware of it?" "That," Poirot said, "is precisely what I intend to determine. Good evening, Mr. Forsyth." He returned to his stateroom and sat at his small writing desk. He drew out a sheet of the ship's notepaper and wrote, in his small, neat hand, a series of names, and beside each name, a series of notations. He drew connecting lines between certain names. He crossed out one connection and replaced it with another. He sat back and looked at the result. Then he picked up his pen and drew a circle around one name. He looked at it for a long time. Then he drew a question mark beside it, because even Poirot, in his considerable experience, was not yet prepared to commit to certainty on the basis of what he knew, rather than what he could prove. But the direction of the thing was becoming visible, like a ship emerging slowly from fog, the fog still present, the details still obscured, but the outline clear enough that a man who knew what he was looking at could say with confidence, "There is land ahead." Chapter 8. The lady confesses to half the truth. She came to him. That was the first surprise. At 7 o'clock in the evening, 20 minutes before the dinner gong, Miss Cecily Marsh knocked on the door of Poirot's stateroom and, when he opened it, looked at him with the grey eyes that missed nothing and said, "I need to tell you something," he admitted her. She sat in the single armchair without being invited, which told him she had not come to perform deference. She had come because she had decided, on her own terms and in her own time, that speaking to him was the correct tactical choice. "You already know I lied this morning," she said. "I know you told me you went to bed early, which I did not believe. I was on the promenade deck at 11:30. I heard voices below, on the boat deck. I went to the rail and looked down. I couldn't see clearly. It was very dark, but I could see two figures. One was," she paused, not from uncertainty, organizing. "One was the man they found this morning. I couldn't identify him at the time, but the description they circulated matches. And the other?" She met his eyes steadily. "I couldn't see the face. The light was wrong and the angle was wrong. But the posture, the way the person stood, the silhouette." She paused again. "The person with the dead man was not one of the first-class passengers." Poirot was very still. "You are certain?" "I am certain of the silhouette. The clothing, the posture, the build. This was not someone travelling in first class. This was a crew member, or someone from another class." Poirot absorbed this. It redirected several things he had been considering. "And you did not raise the alarm?" "I heard what they were saying. Some of it." She looked at her hands for a moment. "Thomas Renner. I know that name. I was going to tell you eventually. I came to tell you now because I believe you're close to some conclusions, and I'd rather you had accurate information before you act on them." "Who are you, Miss Marsh?" Poirot said, with a gentleness that was not softness. "My name is Cecily Marsh. That part is true. I am a private inquiry agent." She said it straightforwardly, without apology. "I was engaged 6 weeks ago by a client in London to travel to New York and make contact with a firm of American attorneys, to deliver to them a series of documents relating to a fraudulent property transaction in Bristol." She looked up. "Documents that were not in my possession, that were to be delivered to me on this ship by a contact by Thomas Renner." Poirot let the silence settle. "Thomas Renner was your contact?" "Was. Yes." "And the note found in his jacket, R, stateroom 14, has what you seek?" She blinked. A real reaction for once. "I didn't know about that note." "The R," Poirot said. "Renner, not the recipient, the carrier." He watched her process this. The note was not addressed to Forsyth. It was about Forsyth. Someone sent Renner to tell someone that Forsyth, in stateroom 14, possesses whatever is being sought. He paused. "But Forsyth told me he was expecting Renner to bring him documents, which means either Forsyth lied to me or Renner was playing two sides," Cecily said. She was fast, he noted, genuinely fast, working for Forsyth ostensibly, but also feeding information to someone else, someone who wanted to know where Forsyth kept the documents. "The documents," Poirot said slowly, "that you were sent to obtain and take to American attorneys." She nodded. "My client has the originals locked away in London, copies of the fraudulent registrations. But the one thing missing, the one document that makes the case legally conclusive, is a witness statement. A signed, witnessed statement from someone who participated in the transaction and is now willing to testify. Thomas Renner was that witness." She was very quiet for a moment. "He was going to give me a signed statement and travel to New York under my client's protection to testify in the American proceedings. And instead someone killed him." "Yes." "Who sent you, Miss Marsh? Who is your client?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Sir Edmund Hartwell." Chapter 9. The Retired Judge's Ruin. He found Sir Edmund in the smoking room at 8 o'clock, after dinner, sitting with a brandy he had not drunk and a cigar he had not lit. The room was quiet at that hour. Most passengers had moved to the ballroom for the evening's entertainment, and the two men had a corner effectively to themselves. "She told you," the judge said, before Poirot had seated himself. "She told me some of it." Poirot settled into the adjacent chair and declined the steward's inquiry about refreshments with a small wave. "I think you will tell me the rest." Sir Edmund turned the brandy glass in his large, still hands. "Gerald Forsyth," he said, "you know the nature of the fraud case against him? A fraudulent property conveyance in Bristol, beneficial ownership concealed behind shell companies, a warehouse complex on the docks. It is much larger than that." The judge's voice was very level, the voice of a man who has been managing a large thing carefully for some time. "The warehouse complex is the surface. Below it is a network of false registrations covering dock facilities across 3 port cities, all beneficially owned by Forsyth through companies that don't officially connect to him. The estimated fraudulent value is close to £2.5 million. The fraud has cost legitimate businesses, small importers, pension funds that invested in what they believed were genuine property holdings. It has cost them considerably. And the criminal case against Forsyth collapsed 4 years ago when the key witness withdrew his statement. The witness was a junior partner at the Bristol solicitors' firm. Sir Edmund paused. He withdrew his statement under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained, but that I have since established amounted to financial coercion. Forsyth paid him to disappear, and remain disappeared. Thomas Renner knew this. Renner worked the docks in Bristol. He was a trusted loader for Forsyth's operation for 3 years before he understood what he was involved in. When the criminal case collapsed, he kept quiet out of fear. But his conscience, people have them, Monsieur Poirot, even in surprising places. His conscience deteriorated his health more than the dock work ever did. He came to me 6 months ago. A brief pause. I was the judge who presided over the original fraud hearing, before the evidence collapsed. I was deeply unsatisfied with the outcome. You have pursued this personally. I have pursued it, yes. For the first time, something cracked very slightly in the judge's composed surface. My son, Monsieur Poirot, was among the investors who lost money in Forsyth's scheme. Not a great sum by Forsyth standards, enough, by my son's, to destroy a young business he had built over 7 years. He died of heart failure 8 months ago. He was 34. He was quiet. I am aware that my judgment in this matter is not impartial. I am equally aware that I no longer particularly care. Poirot was silent for a respectful moment. He thought of the photograph pressed against the judge's chest. He thought of grief kept private and professionally contained. "You arranged for Renner to board the Atlantic Queen," he said. "I arranged for him to board in Southampton as an unregistered crew addition. It can be done, with the right contacts and a cooperative cargo official. The plan was for him to make contact with Miss Marsh on the 2nd evening of the crossing, sign the statement in her presence, and travel with her to New York under assumed identity. By the time we docked, the statement would be in the hands of attorneys in New York who could initiate American proceedings against Forsyth's US-based assets, which are extensive. But something went wrong. Someone found out." The judge's voice was steady, but his hands, Poirot noticed, were not quite. Either Forsyth knew Renner was compromised and had him followed, or someone else, someone I don't know about, was watching this situation and chose to intervene. "What does Forsyth know that you sought him out on this ship?" Sir Edmund looked up. "I didn't seek him out. The booking for this crossing was made 4 months ago, when I was informed, 2 weeks ago, that Forsyth had booked the same crossing, evidently travelling to New York himself on some related commercial matter. I took it as an opportunity rather than a coincidence. Renner was already arranged. I told Miss Marsh which crossing to book. And Forsyth on the same ship. Does he know why you are here?" "I believe he knows I am someone he should regard with extreme caution." A very slight, mirthless smile. "We did encounter each other, briefly, at a social function in London some months ago. He will have made inquiries since." Poirot rose. "Sir Edmund, I need you to do something that will be difficult. Tell me. Do nothing. Trust no one. Say nothing. Give me until tomorrow morning. By that time, I believe I will know who killed Thomas Renner and why. I need you to allow me to proceed without interference." The judge looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has spent 31 years making judgments about who could be trusted and to what degree. "Very well," he said. "Until tomorrow morning." Bon. Poirot turned to go, and then, as was his habit in these final moments of a scene, he paused. "The photograph you carry, it is your son." A long silence. "It is. I am sorry," Poirot said simply, and left. Chapter 10. Below the Waterline at Midnight. He spent 2 hours that evening in a methodical examination of what he knew and what he still required. The shape of the crime was becoming clear. Thomas Renner, a dock worker turned reluctant witness, had been brought aboard the Atlantic Queen to sign a statement that would have devastated Gerald Forsyth's empire and sent him, ultimately, to prison. Someone had killed him before that statement could be signed. 3 people had motive: Forsyth himself, who would have known Renner represented his legal destruction, anyone working for Forsyth for the same reason, and, a darker possibility, someone who wanted to possess the statement themselves, not to suppress it, but to use it for some private advantage. The note in Renner's jacket pocket was the key that unlocked the third possibility. The note had not been written for Forsyth. Forsyth was the subject of the note, not the recipient. Someone had sent Renner with information about Forsyth, and that someone expected Renner to report back, to an R. But Renner himself was the R. Poirot stopped. He sat in his stateroom at 10 o'clock, very still, and thought about this. The note had been written to Renner by someone who was coordinating the operation, someone who knew that Forsyth was in stateroom 14, knew that Forsyth had what they sought, and was instructing Renner to verify this, to be certain, before proceeding. This was not a note from a victim, this was a note from a planner to an operative, which meant Renner had been carrying instructions from someone higher up in the scheme, and that someone higher up was not Sir Edmund. Sir Edmund's plan was for Renner to deliver a statement to Miss Marsh, not to search Forsyth's stateroom. There was a fourth person, a fourth party, unknown to all 3 of the others, with a different agenda entirely. Poirot thought about Forsyth's flat blue eyes and the way he had said, in their conversation on the boat deck, if such a document existed, who else on this ship might be aware of it? He had been genuinely asking, not deflecting, genuinely asking, because he was genuinely afraid of someone he didn't know. He thought about the night steward's description: slight build, light-footed, long dark coat. He put on his own coat and went out. At 11:40, exactly the time Hobbs had seen the figure on the stairway, Poirot descended by the same route, moving carefully and quietly through the interior passages that connected the first-class section to the lower decks. He was not certain what he expected to find. He was conducting what he privately termed an experiment in atmosphere, standing where the crime had stood, feeling the ship's particular geography, testing whether the thing could have been done as he was beginning to believe it had been done. The cargo access passage was cold and smelled of steel and oil. At this hour, the lower decks were largely quiet, the working activity concentrated forward. The passage ran aft for perhaps 40 feet before meeting the companionway. At the base of the companionway, the spot where Thomas Renner had been found, there was a stanchion, painted white, and above it a single overhead light of low wattage. Poirot stood in this circle of dim light and thought. From above, on the promenade deck, you could not see into this passage. You could hear voices if you were very close to the rail and the wind was right. Miss Marsh had heard voices. She had seen 2 figures from above, but she had said one figure was not a first-class passenger, a crew member, she had said, or someone from another class. Poirot looked up at the companionway above him, following its angle with his eyes. If you stood here, at the base of this stairway, and you struck a man at the base of the skull, where would you have to stand? Behind him. coming from behind and above, coming down the companionway. The killer had come from above, from first class. Poirot moved to the side of the companionway and looked at the underside of the metal stair treads. There was, on the underside of the fifth step from the bottom, a small dark smear. He bent closer. He produced his small electric torch from his coat pocket and directed its beam. A smear of brownish residue, and caught in the steel joint, a thread of fabric, dark navy, fine weave. He carefully collected the thread and placed it in his handkerchief. Then he ascended the stairs and walked, in the darkness, thinking quite clearly now. The killer had stood on the stairs, above Renner, and struck downward, which meant the killer had arranged or exploited a meeting in which Renner would be standing at the base of the companionway, looking up, perhaps, at the person he expected to see. Looking up, and therefore with his back to whoever came at him from the stair. Two people at the site of the murder. One of them had killed Thomas Renner. The other one, the person Miss Marsh had seen from the promenade deck, had been the decoy, the person Renner was looking at while death came from behind. Chapter 11. The second pair of shoes. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Poirot asked Captain Moreau to assemble all 14 first-class passengers in the ship's drawing-room. He asked this in the quiet, undemonstrative tone of a man who knows the request will be honoured and does not find it necessary to perform authority. "You have enough?" the captain asked. "I have enough," Poirot said. "I will need the ship's doctor present, and Lieutenant Pemberton, and your purser, Mr. Fenwick. And one more thing." He paused. "I should like the night steward, Hobbs, to be available, though not in the room. I may need him at a particular moment." At 5 minutes past 9, 13 of the 14 requested passengers were assembled. The drawing-room had been arranged with chairs in a loose semicircle. Not a theatrical arrangement, Poirot had insisted, merely a practical one. People could see each other, which was, in his experience, often more productive than seeing only him. Gerald Forsyth sat with the careful composure of a man conserving energy for whatever came next. Sir Edmund Hartwell sat with his hands clasped, and his expression that of a judge at the beginning of a hearing. Lady Fanshawe had arranged herself as though attending a slightly unusual social function. Mrs. Agatha Rowe sat beside her, thin hands in her lap, eyes moving. 4 other couples of varying description completed the group. Miss Cecily Marsh sat slightly apart from all of them, her grey eyes on Poirot. "I thank you all," Poirot began, "for your patience and your time. I will not keep you long. I know who killed Thomas Renner, and I intend to name them in this room, with the evidence that supports that naming, and I ask only that you hear me through to the end, before anyone feels impelled to speak." He had their complete attention. Even Lady Fanshawe had ceased rearranging her rings. Thomas Renner was a dock worker from Southampton. He came aboard this ship as an unregistered passenger to perform a service, to deliver a signed witness statement to a private inquiry agent, also aboard this ship, for transport to legal proceedings in New York. The statement concerned fraudulent property transactions in Bristol, in which a specific individual, Gerald Forsyth, was the primary beneficiary. Forsyth's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Mr. Forsyth was also aboard this ship, travelling to New York on what he described as a commercial matter. The nature of that commercial matter, I now believe, was the protection of his American assets in anticipation of the legal proceedings that were being assembled against him. Poirot paused. "Mr. Forsyth is not the killer." A ripple of reaction moved through the room. "He had motive," Poirot continued. "He had, potentially, the means. A man of his background knows how to apply pressure, in many ways. But he did not kill Thomas Renner, and I know this because of what was found in the dead man's jacket." He produced the note, or rather, the copy he had made of it. The original had been formally provided to Captain Moreau after the 4 hours Dr. Finlay had conceded. He read it aloud. Stateroom 14. Has what you seek. Be certain." This note was written by a fourth party, someone unknown, initially, to all three of the principals in this drama. Unknown to Forsyth, unknown to Sir Edmund, unknown to Miss Marsh. Someone who had learned of Renner's role, of Sir Edmund's operation, of Forsyth's presence on this ship, and who intended to use all of these elements for their own purposes. He turned to face a specific point in the semicircle. The note was addressed to Renner, with instructions. Verify that Forsyth had a document in his possession. What you seek, and be certain. This language reveals something. The document this fourth party sought was not the witness statement Renner was meant to provide to Miss Marsh. It was a different document, one that Forsyth himself carried, not a legal weapon against Forsyth, a weapon that Forsyth used himself, evidence of the coercion that had suppressed the original witness 4 years ago, evidence that would protect Forsyth because it could be used to threaten those who threatened him. This fourth party wanted that document. Blackmail, Sir Edmund said quietly. He had gone very still. Blackmail, Poirot confirmed. Not justice, not legal remedy, simple, direct blackmail. They intended to obtain the coercion evidence and use it to extract money from Forsyth in exchange for silence. And Thomas Renner, useful, biddable Thomas Renner, was their instrument. He had been approached, separately from Sir Edmund's operation, by this person. Promised money, asked to locate the document in Forsyth's stateroom and confirm its presence. But Renner was going to betray them, Miss Marsh said. She was thinking aloud, Poirot could see, following his reasoning with the intelligence he had come to expect of her. Renner, I believe, had discovered the nature of what he was being asked to do. He was a man of compromised conscience, but not absent conscience. Deliver a statement for justice that he could reconcile with. Search a man's stateroom to facilitate blackmail. That he could not. He went to meet his contact, the blackmailer, the night before his death, to refuse, or to negotiate. The meeting was arranged at the base of the cargo companionway, a discreet location suggested by the blackmailer who knew the ship's layout. Poirot let the silence lengthen. The blackmailer did not accept refusal. They killed him. Chapter 12. The Thread and the Testimony. You told me, Poirot said to the room at large, a series of things that were, each in its way, informative. Not for their content, but for their character. He moved as he spoke, not pacing, merely shifting, a technique he had developed over many years to prevent his audience from settling into the passive attention of an audience and to maintain them in the more productive posture of participants. I asked Mrs. Agatha Rowe about her history, and she told me about her time with a solicitor's firm in Bristol and about Gerald Forsyth's name appearing in documents she had typed. This was true. I am satisfied it was true. But what Mrs. Rowe chose not to tell me, what she edited carefully from her account, was that she had left that position not merely to enter Lady Fanshaw's employ, but because she had, in the months before leaving, copied several of those documents, for her own purposes. Mrs. Rowe's face had gone the colour of the linen tablecloths. That is true, Poirot said, not unkindly. Mrs. Rowe, you recognised Forsyth when you saw him board this ship, as you told me. But your fear was not merely that he might recognise you. It was that he might learn what you had, and what you intended to do with it. You had, independently, assembled your own version of the evidence against him. And you had, independently, made contact with Thomas Renner, whose name appeared in the Southampton dock records you were able to access through your legal connections. You approached him. You offered him money to confirm the existence of the coercion document in Forsyth's possession. Lady Fanshaw's considerable bosom swelled. Agatha, is this? Please, Lady Fanshaw, Poirot said. One moment more. He produced the thread from his pocket. It lay in the white handkerchief, dark navy, fine weave, unmistakably the quality of a good quality woman's evening coat. Navy blue, he said. Fine wool, The sort of fabric found in a good quality woman's coat of the kind, he turned to the purser, Fenwick, that is listed in Mrs. Rowe's luggage manifest. One navy wool evening coat, 3/4 length, filed when she boarded, as is standard for first-class passengers. Fenwick, who had been briefed quietly that morning, nodded with the minimal motion of a man who understood his role. A fragment of this fabric was found on the underside of the cargo companionway stair, where Thomas Renner died. The killer came from above and behind, from the stairway, and in doing so, snagged the coat on the steel joint of the 5th step. The room was absolutely silent. The night steward, Hobbs, Poirot continued, described the figure he saw entering the internal stairway at 11:40, the time of Renner's death, as slight, light-footed, in a long dark coat. The movement, he said, was quick. Light-footed is the phrase that arrested my attention. There are people in this room who walk lightly. Mrs. Rowe, he turned to face her directly, I noticed on the first occasion we met that you move with a particular quietness, a habit developed, perhaps, over 7 years of moving through a house with Lady Fanshaw's particular sensitivities about noise. Mrs. Rowe was staring at him with the expression of a woman who has reached the end of a calculation and found the result. I didn't mean, she began. Mrs. Rowe, Poirot's voice for the first time had an edge, not cruel, but clear. Please, the time for edited truths is past. A long silence. Lady Fanshaw's hand found Mrs. Rowe's arm, and then, registering what was being said, withdrew. He wasn't going to do it, Mrs. Rowe said. Her voice was flat now, emptied of its careful social registers. Renner, he came to tell me he wouldn't go through with it. He was only willing to sign the statement for Sir Edmund's people. He said the rest of it, what I wanted, was wrong. A brief, horrible laugh. A dock labourer, lecturing me about what was wrong. He had the moral clarity that is sometimes found in unexpected places, Poirot said quietly. He was going to tell someone. I could see it in his face. He was about to go and tell someone I'd approached him, and then everything would have unravelled before I'd got what I came for. She looked at her hands. I'd brought it from my cabin. I'd thought, if he refused, I'd thought perhaps I could frighten him, just frighten him. And then he turned away from me and started up the stairs, and it wasn't planned. It wasn't what I intended. Most unplanned things, Poirot said, are nevertheless completely consistent with what the person intended. They merely differ in timing. She said nothing more. Lieutenant Pemberton moved, at Poirot's nod, to Mrs. Rowe's side. Chapter 13. The Evidence That Remained. The formalities of the following hours were not, in Poirot's opinion, his province. He delivered what he had to Lieutenant Pemberton and Captain Morrow with the comprehensive precision of a man who files his documents correctly and expects them to be used accordingly. Mrs. Rowe was confined to her stateroom under supervision for the remainder of the crossing, pending her formal arrest upon docking in New York. The instrument of death was recovered at 3 o'clock that afternoon from the bottom of Mrs. Rowe's second trunk, wrapped in a spare stocking, and then inside a hat box bearing Lady Fanshaw's name, a choice of concealment that reflected, Poirot thought, both ingenuity and a certain habitual tendency to use her employer as cover. It was a glass paperweight, smooth-surfaced and moderately heavy, of the kind produced as souvenir items and sold in gift shops throughout England. A map of Bristol Harbour was embedded in its depths. Bristol, the same harbour where Thomas Renner had worked the docks, and Gerald Forsyth had built his fraudulent empire, and a young solicitor's secretary had learned, over 4 careful years, the commercial architecture of crime. The documents Mrs. Rowe had copied, the evidence she had assembled over months, were found in a sealed envelope within the same trunk. They were, Dr. Finlay noted when Poirot showed them to him, impressively comprehensive. Agatha Rowe had not been an amateur. She had been methodical, patient, and, until the moment she was not, precise. She might have done something legitimate with this, the doctor observed. Perhaps she considered it, Poirot said. The legitimate path is longer and offers no guarantee. The blackmailer's path is shorter and offers, or appears to offer, certainty. Many people have stood at that junction and made the wrong turning. The evening was calm. The Atlantic was generous with clear skies and a moon that laid a corridor of light across the water in the direction the ship was heading. At dinner, the atmosphere in the first-class saloon was the specific kind that follows resolved crisis. Not celebratory, but lighter, as though a weight has been redistributed into more manageable portions. Gerald Forsyth dined alone and left early. He had been formally informed that the coercion documents Mrs. Rowe had sought in his possession, which did exist, Poirot had confirmed this privately, would form part of the evidence chain to be examined by American attorneys in New York. He had said very little in response to this information, but the flat blue eyes had, for once, contained something other than contained calculation. Miss Cecily Marsh delivered her own formal account to Lieutenant Pemberton and made arrangements by wireless with the New York attorneys. The matter of the witness statement, unsigned and lost with Thomas Renner, would require reconstruction. Other witnesses, other documents. It was not over. "Will you continue with it?" Poirot asked her at dinner, where she had accepted, for the first time, an invitation to join another passenger's table. "My client will continue," she said. "Sir Edmund has 31 years of legal knowledge and a considerable private motivation. I expect to be employed for some time." Sir Edmund Hartwell dined with the composure that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from long acquaintance with it. He had thanked Poirot that afternoon, in the plain language of a man not given to ornament. "I am in your debt. You are in no one's debt," Poirot had replied. "Justice is not a commercial transaction." He had paused. Thomas Renner deserved better than he received. He chose, in the end, to act correctly. That should be known. "It will be," Sir Edmund said. Poirot took his post-dinner walk along the promenade deck at 10 o'clock. The night was clear, and the stars had returned in their full Atlantic abundance. The sky so crowded with them that it produced, as it had 2 nights before, that sensation of productive humility. He stood at the rail and thought about a woman who had spent 4 years learning the architecture of crime, and then 3 more months constructing a blackmail scheme from her accumulated knowledge, and who had ultimately been undone, not by Poirot's detection, but by the unexpected conscience of a dock labourer who had decided, in the last minutes of his life, to do the right thing. Thomas Renner had refused to be the instrument of blackmail. That refusal had cost him his life. It had also, in the end, solved the crime, because a man who refused to be used and was therefore killed was a man who had not died by chance, and not died at the hand of an obvious suspect, and not died in a way that could long remain mysterious to a mind willing to follow the evidence where it led, rather than where it was convenient. Chapter 14. The view from the stern Poirot was a man who found the sea, on balance, philosophically useful. Not comfortable, he remained unconvinced that movement was preferable to stillness as a mode of existence, and he was profoundly looking forward to dry land. But useful. The ocean's indifference had the paradoxical effect of clarifying the importance of the small human dramas conducted across its surface. Everything that mattered was human. Everything else was merely backdrop. He breakfasted on the final morning of the crossing with the composed satisfaction of a man who has done what he set out to do and whose moustaches remain, despite everything, in excellent order. New York was, by this hour, visible as a shimmer on the horizon, not yet the famous skyline, but the suggestion of it, the quality of the light that changes when a great city is near. The Atlantic Queen had slowed slightly, adopting the measured pace of approach. Miss Marsh found him at the stern rail at 9 o'clock, where he had stationed himself to watch the Atlantic retreating. She stood beside him with the easy companionability of someone who has discovered, in the course of shared difficulty, that they can occupy a space together without requiring conversation. After a time, she said, "Forsyth." "Yes," Poirot said. "He'll escape, won't he? Even now?" "Perhaps. For a time." He looked at the water. These things are rarely resolved in the clean manner of fiction. The law is a slow instrument, and money is an excellent lubricant. But Sir Edmund is patient and persistent, and the documents exist. The threads have been pulled, and threads, once pulled, cannot be pushed back. And Mrs. Rowe will face trial in New York, which has its own clarity. She killed a man, and she will answer for it. He was quiet. She was not a monster. She was a very intelligent woman who looked at an unjust situation and concluded that the direct path to remedy was the correct one. She was wrong about the method, not about the injustice. That doesn't excuse it. No, Poirot agreed. It does not excuse it, but it explains it. Understanding is not the same as excusing. It is simply more complete. Miss Marsh was quiet for a moment. "You knew about the second figure," she said. "The one I saw from the promenade deck. You knew it wasn't the killer." "I suspected. The killer struck from behind and above, from the stairway." A second person was present, facing Renner, holding his attention, while Mrs. Rowe descended the stairs from above. The second figure was, I believe, Renner's own reflection. That is, someone he expected to meet, someone who had also arranged a meeting at that location. Poirot turned from the rail. Renner had 2 meetings arranged for that night. The meeting with whoever was delivering the note from below. We have not found that person, but they are, I think, of the dock world, a contact of Renner's who came from 3rd class and left before the alarm, and his meeting with Mrs. Rowe. In the confusion of 2 meetings overlapping, in the darkness, Mrs. Rowe saw her moment and took it. The dock contact. "You're not going to pursue them. They delivered a note. They may not have known what would follow." He paused. "I pursue what can be proven, and what matters. The dock worker who passed a message is not my concern today." The skyline had become definite now, the towers of Manhattan rising with their characteristic audacity from the flat grey water, the bridges threading the river distances, the whole improbable vertical ambition of the place acquiring specific shape as the Atlantic Queen moved toward her berth. Poirot watched New York approach with the slightly guarded admiration of a man who has learned that grand spectacles are not necessarily superior to small perfections. But it was, he admitted privately, rather magnificent. "What will you do in New York?" Miss Marsh asked. "I have been invited to consult on a small matter. I confess I am not yet persuaded to accept. I had hoped for a holiday." He smoothed a non-existent imperfection from his lapel. "And you? Deliver what I can to the attorneys, brief them on everything. And then—" a small smile, the first uncalculated expression he had seen from her. "Then I may take a few days. I've never been to New York. It is, I believe, a city of considerable energy." He regarded the approaching skyline, though perhaps, after the Atlantic Queen, a degree of stillness might first be recommended. She laughed, a genuine laugh, brief and clear, and moved away toward the bow, where the view was better. Poirot remained at the stern. He looked at the wake of the ship, the long white disturbance it left in the grey water, already beginning to close, the ocean healing itself with the indifference of something very large and very old. In 20 minutes there would be no evidence that the Atlantic Queen had passed here. The water was very patient. He thought of Thomas Renner, who had worked 30 years among the cranes and the tides of Bristol, and who had in the last weeks of his life made the simple, costly decision to tell the truth. He thought of the particular kind of courage required to be ordinary, to live without powerful friends, without legal protections, without anything but one's own conscience as guide, and to choose correctly anyway. It was, Poirot reflected, the kind of courage that attracted very little notice and deserved considerably more. He reached into his coat pocket and produced his small notebook. He added 3 lines in his small, precise hand. He closed the notebook. He smoothed his moustaches. He gathered himself in the particular way of a man preparing to re-enter the human world after a period of necessary solitude. The Atlantic Queen's horn sounded, one long, deep note that rolled across the water and came back changed from the great stone face of the city ahead. New York was near. The case was closed. And somewhere in the depths of the ocean, the wake of the ship dissolved into the general blue, and the Atlantic moved on as it had always moved, carrying its secrets, indifferent to the small and consequential dramas of the beings who crossed it, dreaming on its surface of justice. Finn,